Hello and welcome to World Regional Geography. I am your instructor, Lisa Pitts, and I am here to introduce you to the chapter for this week, or chapters. In this case, it's just the chapter. This is by no means a way of taking away from the actual reading in the course. It's just to kind of highlight some of the key points and ideas from the week, provide some context, and set up some expectations sometimes. So here we go. So one of the things I like to talk about is note taking. And I'm a big fan of taking notes. I learned how to take notes really well, and I find it a very valuable and useful skill. This skill that I'm looking for is more of an illustrated type of notes, and there's a video on notes if you'd like to watch that. The link to this video slides are located in the module for this week. So when I grade notes, if you turn them in, and it's optional to turn in your notes assignments, but I highly recommend you take notes. But if you are going to take notes, I'd like for them to be in this style. And the reason is there's a lot of research that supports the more time you take with the notes, the more connectivity you make to the notes and things like that. Color, creativity, engaging different parts of the brain really helps you to better understand and absorb the information. So there's 4 parts to the rubric for note grading. The first one is content, and that deals with having explanations and examples. Organization, you want to kind of clump your information together. You don't want to have tons of sentences. You want to highlight major concepts. These are not the types of notes that you can just take on Microsoft Word or something like that and just create like an outline. It's just not going to work. Is there plenty of interaction? Do you have color, creativity, charts, maps, graphs, arrows, things kind of connecting the information? So it shows that you're really kind of making connection, not just duplicating what you've read for the week. And the last one is neatness. You don't want to have a lot of empty space on the page. Do they look collegiate? Does it look like you took some time to really kind of formulate and organize and kind of make nice looking notes? And so there is a rubric for the note activities. And so notes are worth 30 points. Did you turn them in on time is worth the most points. But there are, 4 parts, as I explained before. So, all right, so this is World Regional Geography. And so I thought we would talk about time. So each one of these numbers is going to represent something related to the course. So the first one is the 12 regions of the world. So you've got Europe and Russia, North America, Middle America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, the Antarctic. But really, before we kind of get into that, I wanted to kind of, talk about what is a region and, some of the important concepts. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is Carl Sagan's pale blue dot. Now, Carl Sagan was like the Bill Nye of the 70s. He was all the rage. He was on the Johnny Carson show, and anytime there was something sciencey going on, they call Carl Sagan and be like, hey, can we get a quote? He was a professor at Cornell, which is where Bill Nye the Science Guy went. And, Bill Nye loves Carl Sagan, and I love Bill Nye and his bow ties. So this video is based off of Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, which is just a really long way of saying, let's check out this video. Let me turn on.
That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
And so we open the class by talking about kind of putting into perspective everything that we're going to talk about on a cosmic scale is very small, but to us, it's the only home we've ever known. And so we're going to talk about all of the environmental, all of the regional, all of the historical and cultural and physical manifestations on that pale blue dot. Another thing we'll talk about is that there's two ways of looking at the world, as the core and the periphery. The core includes major world powers and the countries that contain much of the wealth of the planet. The periphery are those countries that are not reaping the benefits of global wealth and globalization. The core periphery model is an economic and spatial theory that describes the distribution of economic power and development within a region or country. It suggests that there are central areas known as the core, which have higher levels of economic activity, infrastructure development compared to the surrounding regions known as the periphery. The core typically consists of urban centers, industrial zones, and areas with advanced infrastructure, while the periphery includes rural and less developed regions. So we can talk about it on a global scale. We have core and periphery countries. We can talk about it on a regional scale. We have like the urban areas and then the periphery, those areas that support the core. This model helps explain patterns of economic inequity and spatial organization of economic activity. There are three ways we're going to approach this subject. When it comes to approaching regional geography, there are various methods and perspectives that can be employed. One is the systematic approach. This approach focuses on the systemic study of physical and human characteristics within a region. It involves examining the physical features, the vegetation, the climate, landforms, natural resources of the region, as well as the human population, culture, economy, social organization. The systematic approach aims to understand the interrelationships and spatial patterns of these elements within a region. It also involves quantitative analysis and the use of maps, charts, and statistical data to study regional variations. Another approach is a functional approach. This emphasizes the organization and interconnectedness, again, within the region. It looks at the relationships and interrelation between different places within the region, focusing on the flow of people, goods, information, resources. It considers the economic activities, communication system, urban-rural relationship. The functional approach helps understand how regions are interconnected and how they contribute to the larger scale spatial organizations, such as national or global systems. Third approach is the cultural and historic approach. This emphasizes the influence of human culture and history on the formation and development of regions. It examines how cultural practices, traditions, beliefs, and historical events shape the characteristics and identities of regions. This approach involves studying the landscapes, the architectural styles, the religions, the languages, and heritage within a region. It also considers the historical processes, colonization, migration, political events that have influenced the regional geography. The cultural historic approach helps us to understand the unique qualities and regional identities that emerge from the interplay of culture and history. These three approaches provide different lenses to study regional geography, and they can be complementary. Depending on the research question or purpose, geographers often combine multiple approaches to gain comprehensive understanding of a particular region. In geography, there's really two main things: physical geography, which again is all of the plate tectonics and volcanoes and earthquakes and climate, and the human geography, the languages, religions, architecture, and then the regions within those physical and human things is another way we can approach this subject. Now, there are four types of projections. We're going to be looking at a lot of maps, and you need to understand that we can't take this three-dimensional thing and turn it into a two-dimensional thing so that we can look at it without there being some sort of distortion going on. So let's watch this video. And then as you're watching the video, I want you to think about what are some of the issues associated with each of the four types of projections. So actually, let me go through the four types. So there's planar projections, which are good for polar areas. There are cylindrical projections, which are good for equators, or if it's transverse, which means you've turned it on its side, then it's good for any line of longitude. Conic projections are good for mid-latitudes, like where we live. And then the last one is the interrupted projection, or what I would call the orange peel model. So it's kind of like you peeled an orange, leaves gaps and stuff in between. So, all right, watch the video. Here we go.
All right, here we go. If I want to turn this globe into a flat map, I'm gonna have to cut it open. In order to get this globe to look anything close to a rectangle lying flat, I've had to cut it in several places. I've had to stretch it so that the countries are starting to look all wonky. And even still, it's almost impossible to get it to lay flat. And that right there is the eternal dilemma of map makers. The surface of a sphere cannot be represented as a plane without some form of distortion. That was mathematically proved by this guy a long time ago. Since around the 1500s, mathematicians have set about creating algorithms that would translate the globe into something flat. And to do this, they use a process called projection. Popular rectangular maps use a cylindrical projection. Imagine putting a theoretical cylinder over the globe and projecting each of the points of the sphere onto the cylinder surface. Unroll the cylinder and you have a flat rectangular map. But you could also project the globe onto other objects, and the math used by map makers to project the globe will affect the way the map looks once it's all flattened out. And here's the big problem. Every one of these projections comes with trade-offs in shape, distance, direction, and land area. Certain map projections can either be misleading or very helpful depending on what you're using them for. Here's an example. This map is called the Mercator projection. If you're American, you probably studied this map in school. It's also the projection that Google Maps uses. The Mercator projection is popular for a couple of reasons. First, it generally preserves the shape of countries. Brazil on the globe has the same shape as Brazil on the Mercator projection. But the original purpose of the Mercator projection was navigation. It preserves direction, which is a big deal if you're trying to navigate the ocean with only a compass. It was designed so that a line drawn between 2 points on the map would provide the exact angle to follow on a compass to travel between those 2 points. If we go back to the globe, you can see that this line is not the shortest route, but at least it provides a simple, reliable way to navigate across the ocean. Gerardus Mercator, who created the projection in the 16th century, was able to preserve direction by varying the distance between the latitude lines, and also making them straight, creating a grid of right angles. But that created some other problems. Where the Mercator fails is its representation of size. Look at the size of Africa as compared to Greenland. On the Mercator map, they look about the same size. But if you look at a globe for Greenland's true size, you'll see that it's way smaller than Africa. By a factor of 14, in fact. If we put a bunch of dots onto the globe that are all the same size, and then project that onto the Mercator map, we will end up with this. The circles retain their round shape, but are enlarged as they get closer to the poles. One modern critique of this is that the distortion perpetuates imperialist attitude of European domination over the southern hemisphere.
The Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
So if you want to see a map that more accurately displays land area, you can use the Gall-Peters projection. This is called an equal area map. Look at Greenland and Africa now. The size comparison is accurate, much better than the Mercator. But it's obvious now that the country shapes are totally distorted. Here are those dots again so that we can see how the projection preserves area while totally distorting shape. Something happened in the late 60s that would change the whole purpose of mapping and the way that we think about projections. Satellites orbiting our planet started sending location and navigation data to little receiver units all around the world.
Today, orbiting satellites of the Navy Navigation Satellite System provide round-the-clock, ultra-precise position fixes from space to units everywhere in any kind of weather.
This global positioning system wiped out the need for paper maps as a means of navigating both the sea and the sky. Map projection choices became less about navigational imperatives and more about aesthetic, design, and presentation. The Mercator projection, that once vital tool of pre-GPS navigation, was shunned by cartographers who now saw it as misleading. But even still, most web mapping tools like Google Maps use the Mercator. This is because the Mercator's ability to preserve shape and angles makes close-up views of cities more accurate. A 90-degree left turn on the map is a 90-degree left turn on the street that you're driving down. The distortion is minimal when you're close up. But on a world map scale, cartographers rarely use the Mercator. Most modern cartographers have settled on a variety of non-rectangular projections that split the difference between distorting either size or shape. In 1998, the National Geographic Society adopted the Winkel triple projection because of its pleasant balance between size and shape accuracy. But the fact remains that there's no right projection. Cartographers and mathematicians have created a huge library of available projections, each with a new perspective on the planet, and each useful for a different task. The best way to see the Earth is to look at a globe. But as long as we use flat maps, we'll have to deal with the trade-offs of projections. And just remember, there's no right answer. If you yourself want to poke fun at the Mercator projection, you can do so by going to thetruesizeof.com which is a fun tool that allows you to drag around whatever country you want around the map and see how it is distorted depending on where it is. I also want to say a big thanks to Mike Bostock, whose open source project on map projections was a huge help in this video. I'll put a link for both of those things down in the description. Which is a fun tool that
It is a fun little tool. Not the true size of.
See how it is distorted depending on where it is.
Kind of
I
crazy.
also want to say a big thanks to Mike Bostock, whose open source project on map projections was a huge help in this video. I'll put a link for both of those things down in the description.
All right. So I've said the word region how many times now? So let's actually talk about what are the 5 themes of geography. 5 themes of geography. Ooh. So this is Mr. Help, and he's here to help us determine what the 5 themes are. So this is a mnemonic device. I love using mnemonic devices. So Mr. Help stands for movement, region, human environment interaction, location, and place. And each of these themes breaks down into various sub ideas, I guess. So movement. So humans move a lot. And I'm not just talking about physically, I'm talking about ideas, goods, resources, communication. We travel, you know. This theme studies the migration across the planet. For example, immigration of Syrians during the war, the flow of water in the Gulf Stream, the expansion of cell phone reception around the planet, are all examples of movement. Regions. This is the main focus of this class. We're going to break down this planet into various regions. So why? Because geographers like talking about things that have something in common. We like to group things together. It makes it easier to understand what's going on if we can kind of tie areas together. So regions divide the world into manageable units of geographic study. They have some sort of characteristic that unifies. It can be a formal region, a functional region, or a vernacular region. So formal regions, these are designated by official boundaries like cities, states, countries. For the most part, they're clearly indicated and publicly known. Functional regions are defined by their connections. For example, the circulation area for a major city is a functional region of the paper. Vernacular regions. These are regions that are perceived, such as the South or the Midwest or even Southern California. Where does Southern California end and the next part of California begin? Well, it depends on how you're defining the region. But when you say Southern California, everybody has an idea what you're talking about. You know, palm trees, movie stars, right? They live next door. All right, the next theme is human environment interaction. Now, it's important to understand that humans have adapted to and modified the environment. We build dams. We build houses, right? We shape the landscape through our interaction in both a positive and a negative way. One way to think about this is how people live in cold climates and have how we mine coal or drill for natural gas in order to heat their homes. Another example would be landfill projects in Boston, which were conducted in the 18th and 19th centuries to expand areas and improve transportation. But the environment also impacts us. So it's like a two-way street. So it's not just how we impact the environment. It's about how the environment impacts us. Where we live, really dependent on the environment, right? I talk a lot about this in a physical geography class. But there's really 2 perspectives on human environment interaction. There's environmental determinism and something called possibilism. So environmental determinism, physical environment shapes culture. This really was kind of discounted as an idea because it had significantly racist undertones. But, you know, it's still recognized as valid. For example, the Southwest was just seen as like a drought-ridden area, but we've done pretty well living in the Southwest, right? Possibilism, on the other hand, is people adapt to the environmental conditions despite of its limitations, include like ski resorts, in like the United Arab Emirates. They have a ski resort there. It's a hot, arid country, but they've managed to do it. Or potato production in Egypt with its low annual rainfall. Rainfall. I almost said rainforest for some reason. I don't know why. I'm sorry. The next theme is location. And most geographic studies begin by learning the location of places. Now, location can be absolute or relative. Now, you don't very often say, oh, come to my house. I live at 33 degrees, 49 minutes, and 11 seconds north, and 117 degrees, 55 minutes, and 7 minutes west, right? But we would probably use like an address instead, right? For example, you might be at like 183 Main Street, any town, USA, or relative location. Now, this describes a place with respect to its environment and its connection to other places. An example is, I'm 1.3 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. Well, actually, I'm not. I'm about 30 miles from the Pacific Ocean, or I'm a half a mile from, Lower Beer Elementary School or something like that, or Chaffee High School, or, whatever you've got going on. So it's relative to, something else that people might know. I like to think of relative location as the location you tell people you're from when you're on an airplane, right? Because, growing up, I grew up in West Covina. People say, where are you from? I say, oh, I'm from West Covina. They're like, where's that? And I go, oh, it's 30 miles east of Los Angeles. Oh, you live in East LA? Well, I live east of LA, but I wouldn't really consider it East LA, but at least then they get the idea that I'm not living with palm trees and movie stars. Right. All right. The last theme of geography is place. And it really breaks into two different ways that we describe a location. The physical location, the physical characteristics, like what is the plant life? What is the topography? Is it mountainous? Is it hilly? Is it sandy? Is there fertile soil? And then the cultural things. What is the political system? What is the religion? What are the common foods? What are some local folklore? What are the means of transportation? Right. So a location can be described as technologically advanced French-speaking democracy with a Catholic majority, right? Which is Quebec. Right. So, all right. Now, there are six main six main climate regions. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. 6 main climate regions in the Köppen classification system. A, which is rainforest. B, which is arid. C is temperate. D is continental. E is polar. And then we have H, which are elevated or highland locations. Now, based on this, we're able to break down these regions a little further. So you can see, for example, the A region, which is considered tropical, has 3 different types of regions within it. They're all considered tropical, but you have tropical, and the second letter means, when is it dry? So M means they have a monsoon season. W means that they have a wet winter. A dry winter. Sorry, W is dry winter. There's also AS climates, not on this map, but there are a few, and we'll talk about some of those where they have dry summers. And then F stands for it rains all freaking time. And the F, M, W, and S translate across in the lowercase letters across the other layers here. B, we've got 4 different types. We have W, which is traditional dry desert. And then we have S, which stands for semi-arid or steppe. And then is it a hot desert or a cold desert? So H is hot, K is cold, because the German word for cold starts with a K. And the system was designed by a guy named Köppen. And so cold starts with a K. And so we can talk about each of these. You'll notice that highland climates aren't on here. Highland climates are those that are, elevated. So as you increase in elevation, you decrease in temperature. And then depending on which side of the mountain you're on, you may have more or less rain. So, all right. World regional geography is a broad exploration of the physical and human geography of Earth. As a course, we'll examine the cultural, economic, environmental, and political characteristics of the world's regions. Major topics will include demographics. What is the political and economic system? What is their level of development? What type of globalization is there? Are there areas of conflict? Are there any environmental issues? And we'll also talk about some current events that are going on in that region. So when we talk about demographics, we're talking about what is the age structure? There are a lot of young people, a lot of old people. What is the gender of these? So what is the gender distribution? It refers to the proportion of males and females within a population. It's often expressed as a sex ratio, which compares the number of males to females. It influences various aspects of society, including social roles, labor force participation, and gender dynamics. We'll talk about ethnicity and race. These demographic factors are essential for understanding diversity, social cohesion, issues related to equality, discrimination, and social integration within the population. We'll talk about nationality and migration. Nationality indicates legal citizenship or allegiance to a particular country. Migration patterns include immigration and emigration. Immigration with an I means people coming in. Emigration with an E means people leaving. Both of these things impact demographics by influencing population size, composition, cultural diversity. Migration can also contribute to demographic changes such as population growth, aging, ethnic diversity. We'll talk about educational attainment. It measures the level of education completed by individuals within the population. It helps gauge literacy rates, access to educational opportunities, and that potentially has an impact on economic development, more importantly, social mobility and workforce capabilities. We'll also talk about income, socioeconomic status, which reflect the economic well-being and social position of individuals within a population. These provide insights into economic equality, inequality, poverty rates, social disparity, and the distribution of resources and opportunities within a society. All of these things play a crucial role in understanding the characteristics, needs, and challenges of a region. And so these are just some of the things we'll talk about. We'll talk about political and economic systems. So, like, is it a democratic system? So particularly in North America, Western Europe, parts of Latin America, they have democratic political systems. So that involves elections, multiple political parties, separation of powers. Is it an authoritarian system? Some regions in like Asia and Africa and the Middle East, these systems may be governed by a single leader or a small group who exercise control over the government, limiting political freedom, suppressing opposition. Is it a communist system? Although less prevalent today than it was in the past. China, Cuba, North Korea all have communist political systems characterized by a single ruling party that controls both the political and economic aspects of society. Is it a theocratic system? This happens a lot in the Middle East. These systems are based on religious principles, governance. religious leaders or institutions hold significant power and influence in a theocracy? Is it a transitional system? Some regions, particularly those experiencing political changes and transitions, have transitional political systems. These are characterized by ongoing political reforms, shift in the power dynamics, new political structure and institution. All right. Talk about economic systems. So is it capitalist? Is it got a command economy? So countries in the former Soviet Union, certain parts of Asia, have a centrally planned economic system. These involve government ownership and control over economic activities with production and resource allocation made by central authorities. So you can see on the little scale here, communist, pure competition, just free market capitalism. We'll talk about how development works. So regional geography plays a crucial role in understanding economic development. So it highlights the significant economic disparities that exist between different regions around the globe. It investigates why regions are economically developed and prosperous than others. We'll look at economic indicators such as gross domestic product or GDP, gross national income, human development index, poverty rates, income distribution, employment rates or unemployment rates. We'll look at various economic sectors. It examines, World Regional Geography examines the composition of the economy. It explores the dominance of primary sectors. Is it agricultural? Is it mostly mining? Or secondary sectors? Are they, have a manufacturing economy or construction economy? Or are they a tertiary sector? Those are their services, tourism, finance. Those are all like tertiary sectors. And we look at all those things and how they shape the development of the region. It also investigates the shift from a traditional sector to emerging sectors such as technology and knowledge-based industries. We'll look at trade and globalization. We'll look at how these regions are connected through global supply chains and challenges presented by globalization for different regions. We'll look at development strategies and policies. This looks at the role of government and international organizations and non-governmental organizations or NGOs in implementing development plans, industrial policies, infrastructure projects, social programs, all that stuff. We'll also look up sustainable development. This emphasizes the importance of the interaction between economic growth and the social well-being and the environmental sustainability. It looks at how regions are addressing environmental challenges, promoting renewable energy, implementing sustainable agricultural practices. We'll talk about some of the countries that are threatened by rising sea levels, some of the things that they're doing in order to solve kind of their development problems. And by looking at these in a regional context, we provide, this provides insights into the complexity, the challenges, the opportunities faced by different regions. It helps us understand those things that promote equitability. Sorry, I don't know why I'm stumbling with that. Equitability, is that, I don't know, and sustainable growth. Can't think the word. I think that's the right word. We'll also talk about globalization. So globalization refers to increasing interconnectedness, integration, interdependence of countries and regions. Follows the flow of goods, services, information, technology across borders, leading to a global network of political and social interaction. So that can be an economic thing. So, for example, OPEC, which is the driving force. It involves like all of the oil producing economic countries or PEC countries. And so they've kind of banded together. So it's led to an integration, the rise of global production networks. We'll talk about regional integrations like the EU or NAFTA. We'll talk about cultural globalization, which refers to the spread of ideas across different regions. It includes diffusion of language, religion, popular culture, like movies, things like that. We're getting a lot of, movies from different regions. And so we'll explore how those influences cultural diversity. We'll talk about environmental globalization. We're all on this planet together. The United States is one of the largest producers of pollution, and yet we don't see a lot of the problems because we're able to, ship a lot of our pollution problems elsewhere. So we'll talk about climate change and how what's going on in the core is affecting the periphery, for example. And these can both be positive and negative things. So we're looking at, again, that interconnectedness, that interdependence of places. We'll talk about diffusion. This is kind of a sidebar. You can't really talk about movement and language and religion moving from region to region without talking about different types of diffusion. And so in geography, the term diffusion refers to the spread of ideas, and people, and cultural practices. Disease is the easiest thing to think about, right? So there's three basic types of diffusion. There's relocation diffusion, which means you leave behind its point of origin, but it's like being changed along the way. So this is like the diffusion of food is a really good relocation diffusion type thing. So, for example, my ancestors come from Ireland, right? So they came during the potato famine. So we ate a lot of corned beef and cabbage growing up, right? So, or I was just, down the street and I saw a falafel place. And I was like, where does falafel come from? So those are relocation diffusion ideas, right? Another type of stimulus diffusion. So in stimulus diffusion, it's trendy. It's just like something's catching, right? So, okay, well, I guess I'll talk about hierarchical diffusion. So another type of diffusion is hierarchical diffusion, which is the spread of a trait across based on those in a particular group or those who have access. So this is typically slower than contagious diffusion, which I haven't talked about yet. But if we talk about something going viral, that's hierarchical diffusion, like something yeah, that's hierarchical. Contagious, though, is more like the spread of a disease. It doesn't follow any rules. It doesn't pay attention to the borders. A forest fire is something that fits that category. In the case of social media, memes go from person to person in a contagious manner, right? So, yeah. And then the last one is stimulus diffusion. I already talked about contagious diffusion. Stimulus diffusion is like skateboarding, a trend, it catches on. When I was growing up, it was about rolling up your jeans, like in a particular way, it's when enslaved people brought voodoo, which had its origins in African traditions, to America. It was blended with Christianity and incorporated many of these important saints. Cat yoga, which is a fad in the US, is much different than the traditional or goat yoga, right? Yes, they don't use cats anymore. They used to do cat yoga. Now they do goat yoga, right? So, or the menu at a McDonald's from around the world. While they resemble the original, many have been adapted to suit local tastes and regional religious food doctrines. So, you can't, India has a McDonald's, but the Big Mac doesn't have any beef in it because cows are sacred animals, right? So we'll also talk about conflicts. Where are the major conflicts going on? We live in an area of relative peace compared to most of history. However, it does not mean there's no conflict going on in the world today. What's going on in Ukraine is a great example of that, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into talking about Russia next week. Middle East is a region known for its long-standing conflicts. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian civil war, Yemen's got stuff going on. Sub-Saharan Africa has experienced numerous conflicts. What's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, South Asia, the India-Pakistan dispute over the Kashmir, the ongoing religious tension in Afghanistan. These have often historical roots. They go way back. These conflicts go way back, right? In Eastern European, the breakup of Yugoslavia led to the Balkan War in the 1990s, which really kind of caused the emergence of new nation states like Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia. We talk about ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities. We can talk about what's going on in East Asia, particularly in the South China Sea, which involves primarily China and Vietnam, the Philippines. Latin America is generally more peaceful compared to some of the other regions, but it has conflicts related to drug trafficking, organized crime, social inequality. And it's important to know the conflict in these regions are complex and multifaceted, involving lots of actors, historical factors, socio-political dynamics, and world regional geography really examines these conflicts to understand their causes and their consequences and potential resolutions. And I want you to keep an open mind when we talk about some of these conflicts and kind of think about it, kind of like, I guess, like my mom used to say, put yourself in somebody else's shoes, which sometimes is hard. So just be open when we start talking about some of these conflicts. Remember, they have a lot of history going on. Talk about environmental issues, deforestation, climate change. When we talk about Russia, we'll talk about, environmental degradation due to Chernobyl, which never was cleaned up. They just kind of locked the gate and walked away. Talk about natural resource management. And so by looking at these things, we'll understand some of the interactions between human activities and the pursuit of sustainable development from foreign policymakers, things like that. We'll talk about pollution and contamination. We'll talk about water scarcity and how people manage water. We'll talk about biodiversity loss, habitat destruction, right? And I hope that I don't need to explain that geography, the study of Earth and how humans interact with it, asks us to investigate the human condition. Current events are often discussed while talking about regional geography because it provides real-time examples, illustrations, concepts, dynamics, and issues within the region. We'll talk about why. So why are these things important? It provides context. They help us to really kind of understand the region. It allows for the application of what we're reading about in the chapter for the week and helps us to really foster a deeper understanding, I hope, It's relevant in timelessness. Geography is concerned with contemporary conditions and changes occurring in different regions. And by looking at these current events, it ensures that discussions are up to date and relevant to the present context. It helps us to really kind of stay informed about the trends in a specific region. And kind of, that's why I really like geography, because it's timely. It's like right there, it's happening right now. We can, read about prior conflicts and then talk about what's going on now and how some of those things have changed and morphed. It also provides an illustration of concepts, provides tangible examples of how geography factors culture, politics, economic systems interact and shape the region. Really, I like to talk about critical analysis. I like when my students think critically and evaluate, looking at the event in the lens of a regional geographer. It's possible to identify spatial patterns and regional disparities and impacts of the outside and the impacts of, not being able to get outside. Like a lot of the conflict sometimes, comes from not really having from having a government that controls what you can and can't do, right? And so it's essential to really kind of have, a solid foundational knowledge, and it's going to be really hard, but we're going to, bring in these current events and kind of bridge that gap between theory and practice. Now, there are 8 things to understand about demographic. 4 of them deal with the demographic transition model, and 4 of them deal with age-sex pyramids. So let's start talking about demographic transition and like where different countries are and how that is related. And this will really kind of come up when we talk about different regions. But stage 1 in the demographic transition model is high birth rate, high death rate. It fluctuates, but they're still high, which means your total population isn't really growing, right? So that's stage 1. And there are a number of stage 1 countries out there. All right. Actually, are there? I don't know. I'm going to have to look into that. I'll get back to you on that. All right. Stage 2, during this, death rate begins to fall. Birth rates still are high, because a lot of times it takes time for humans to really kind of adjust to the fact that, hey, now we have medicine. So our children aren't dying before the age of 5. We're moving from a traditional agrarian society to, an industrial society. And so we don't need 8 kids to work the farm, right? We're okay with just having 2 mouths to feed, for example, right? The next stage is stage 3. Birth rates start to decline. Oh, so you still have in stage 2, your population is going up rapidly, because your birth rates are still high, but people aren't dying. And so, you're looking at a lot of new members of your society. All right. In stage 3, birth rates start to decline. And so the rate of population is still growing, but not as quickly. And then in stage 4, these are characterized by low birth and low death rates. Population growth is negligible. It may even start to decline. And then stage 5 is what we call declining. And then natural increase is just kind of, population is still going up a little bit, but not really. It's growing slowly, right? And so we'll talk about regions and where they are in this, transition model. Population pyramids are graphical representations of the population, their age and gender distribution. It consists of horizontal bars stacked on top of each other. Each bar represents a specific age group or cohort, typically divided into males and females. The horizontal axis represents the population size or percentage, while the vertical axis represents the different age groups. So you can see in, this is Switzerland. And so in the 1900s, they're very broad. That means they had a lot of babies, not a lot of old people, right? So this is like stage 1. So they had a lot of babies. Well, they didn't really die off all that much. This is probably stage 2. They were probably in stage 2 in the second thing. This is an interesting one. In 2000, they had this baby boom population. So they had a significant decline in their birth rate after. So ours kind of isn't as dramatic as this. But if you look at this particular pyramid, you can see that bubble, that population bubble, the baby boom generation. And now they're anticipating this to become more of like columnar. So there's like 4 basic shapes to the population pyramid. There's the, rapidly expanding pyramid. So huge die off. Then there's the expanding, which looks like a traditional triangle. Then what we call a stationary. So it looks more like a column or a dome. And then the contracting, which means they have negative population growth. For example, Japan. Japan is at negative population growth. They do not have enough young people to replace the older people. They live to be a long time, right? So, and we'll look at various pyramids like this throughout the course. And when they come up, I'll, if you need help, just ask. All right. So we'll talk about scale. There's 9 different meanings for scale. One of the central concepts in geography is scale. In very rough terms, it refers to how big or small something is. That something can be an event, it could be a process, it could be some other phenomenon. In geography, we focus on the spatial scale. Spatial scale is the extent of the area of which the phenomenon or process occurs. For example, water pollution, it can occur at a small scale, like a creek, or it can be at a large scale, like the entire Chesapeake Bay. Spatial scale also refers to the area or spatial extent at which it is aggregated to be analyzed and understood. For example, while there are differences in levels of pollution in different areas of Chesapeake Bay, one may choose to aggregate water quality measurements to make a general statement about the pollution in the bay as a whole. So, for example, there was a big die-off of fish in Redondo Beach. And so if we talk about, that big die-off, we're not going to talk about the entire Pacific Ocean, right? But if we wanted to, we could say, well, 3 million fish in the entire ocean died of, 36 billion, right? Small percentage. But if you say 3 million out of 5 million, that's a huge percentage, right? So a lot of times we can play with these scales of phenomenon in order to kind of make things seem more tangible, I guess is one way of looking at it. Geographers sometimes also discuss like temporal scale, which is duration or the time length of things. Consider air pollution, right? This exists at the scale of a city or a metropolitan area. The city will have cars, it'll have power plants, right, and other things that cause air pollution. And that air pollution will affect people who live in the city and breathe the air there. People elsewhere may not be affected. Now, yeah, sure, sometimes the wind kind of blows it and sends the pollution further away, but in contrast, climate change largely exists on a global scale. And we'll kind of talk more about climate change in greater detail later in this course. Because climate is a process that covers the whole planet, when we change the climate somewhere, we can change it everywhere. So scale matters in understanding the interaction between humans and the environment, that human-environment interaction thing, right? It's important to appreciate that phenomenon can be considered or observed at multiple scales. For example, we can look at climate change on a global scale, since it's a global process. However, we can also look at it on a local scale. So climate change is caused by, among other things, many individual decisions to burn fossil fuels. So it can also impact people and ecosystems in a local place across the world. We can talk about cartographic scale. This refers to like what the scale is on the map. So probably not going to get like really nitty gritty on it in this class, but cartographic scale is how we measure things. So like the ratio or the representation of the map versus the real world. And then we can talk about things on a large or a small scale. So large scale, lots of details, small scale, not a lot of details. I needed something for the 10. So exploring the reasons behind population growth in a specific area is analogous to examining the geographical distribution of people. So these were the 10 biggest cities in the 1950s. So there were 12.4 million people in Newark, New York. So that's Newark, New Jersey, and New York put together, and 11.3 in Tokyo, Japan in 1950. Now, the 10 most populous cities are predominantly found in countries classified as developing. These countries typically experience high rates of population growth. This deals with the number of births surpassing the number of deaths. And so we'll start talking about birth rates and death rates and what we call the natural increase and all that good stuff. You'll read about all these things. So natural increase is just birth rate, death rate minus birth rate. So the number of people that died versus the number that people have born. So if you have, we'll just say 10 people who die and 7 people are born, then your natural increase is -3. Right? You're a declining population. Of course, we're not going to talk about 10 people. We're going to talk about like 10 million people. And we're not going to talk about 3 babies. We're going to be talking about 3 million babies or 30 million babies or something like that. These will be the world's biggest cities in 2030. So again, if we look at in the 1950s, developing. Buenos Aires is developing. Osaka, Japan, developed. But now, you got all the Cairo, Laos, Nigeria, places like Laos. Why did I say Laos, Nigeria? Lagos, Nigeria, the capital of Nigeria. Lagos. All right. Talk about, okay, we're almost done. We got 11 things about latitude and longitude. So latitudes are also known as parallels. They're often confusing because they run east-west, but they tell us how far north and south we are. Longitude are also known as meridians. They run north and south, but they tell us how far east and west we are. There are, some really important lines. This deals with, seasons, season it is, deals with incoming solar radiation, it deals with growth, it deals with climate patterns. And so understanding that there are some important lines of latitude. So the Arctic and Antarctic Circle is up in the north. It's at 66 degrees north. Antarctic Circle, or as I affectionately call it, the anti-Arctic. So the opposite of the Arctic Circle, 66 degrees south. You've got the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, which denote the farthest that the sun's direct rays will be at. And so basically the direct rays of the sun go between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. In fact, today we've got the summer solstice. So that means that the sun is directly over the Tropic of Cancer today, June 21st. International dateline is actually a line of longitude. It's out in the Pacific Ocean. It's where day starts. The North and South Pole, prime meridian goes through Greenwich, England, also called the Greenwich line. So these are some important lines of latitude and longitude. All right. This is world regional geography. There are 12 regions of the world, question mark. So the number of regions of the world can vary depending on what criteria you use to define and delineate them. There is no universally agreed upon standard for dividing the world into specific regions. Kind of like there is no universally agreed upon definition of Southern California. Again, depending on how you define the region of Southern California will determine where you draw the border for Southern California, right? So until there is a state called Southern California, there is no regional delineation of Southern California, right? So there are some commonly recognized divisions. So the UN divides the world into 5 regional groups. Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, or Southern Asia, Antarctica, Australia, and the North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. There's continental divisions. So North and South America, and there's even disagreement about how many continents there are. So this is it's typically divided into 7 continents: Africa, Antarctica, Asia, Europe, North America, Australia, South America. These are based on geographic and tectonic considerations. But is there really, don't even get me started. In my physical geography class, I talk about he who makes the map makes the rules. So if a continent is a large landmass surrounded by water, North America surrounded by water, Africa surrounded by water, Australia surrounded by water, where is the water that separates Europe and Asia, right? So it really should be Eurasia. There really should be 6. So not even that do we really agree upon. Geopolitically, this is based on political, historical, and cultural factors. Examples include the Middle East, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or East Asia, and things like that. The World Bank divides the world into 6 regional divisions: East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Regional divisions based on physical geography. Some regional divisions are based on natural features. For example, the Amazon rainforest, the Sahara Desert, right? The Himalayas, right? It's important to note because these are just a few examples of the regional divisions. There are many others that, we could be bogged down on. I should have said 12 ways to define the 12 regions, right? But really, it's, the choice depends on the context and the purpose of study and analysis being conducted. What is your, what do you want to study will determine how you're going to break down the regions. So in my research, I found this really kind of interesting, web article by Jeff Jones. He decided to use something called the similarity index. So let's watch this video and see what you think. Where's my video? Here it is.
I've always wondered how similar or different 2 different countries are. For example, one might intuitively know that Germany is more like the United States than Iran, but less like the United States than Canada. The index is a statistically based way to measure this. The index weights 5 major aspects of countries: their demographics, culture, politics, technology, and geography. In addition, these aspects were divided into two parts, quantity and quality. For instance, Romania and Ireland have the same amount of cars per person. However, Ireland drives on the left, while Romania drives on the right. Another example of this quantity and quality is Bosnia and Jamaica. Bosnia and Jamaica have a similar percentage of agricultural land. However, Jamaica predominantly grows coconuts, while Bosnia mostly grows corn. The demographics section considers the individuals in a country and their personal characteristics. This includes the country's average age, their average height and weight, as well as the country's gender ratio. For instance, in some countries, they have more males than females, such as in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, where there are around 3 males for every female. While other countries like in Eastern Europe, there are more females than males. The demographics section also considers the race and ethnicity of people in the country. Ethnicity being defined as their native language and traditional religious background. In addition, the demographics section includes the marriage and divorce rates in the country, the birth rate, and the household size. It also considers how wealthy and educated the people are in the country. Furthermore, demographics includes the employment rate and typical occupation of people in the country. In countries like Nigeria, Nepal, and Papua New Guinea, the vast majority of the people are farmers, whereas in Argentina, Germany, and Australia, most people work in the service sector. There are also some countries with a large portion of the population working in industry, like in Canada, Brunei, and Oman. A second aspect that I looked at was a country's culture. This is a very difficult aspect to look at because it's hard to put a statistic on a country's culture, but I divided it up into different categories, one including behavior, personality of the people in the country, what their typical conduct is, if there's a lot of violence in that country, and also if there's a lot of drug use there. Another aspect of culture that I looked at was the communication used in that country. Now, this is slightly different from demographics. In the demographics, when you're looking at language, you're looking at language they're using at home. But in culture, we're sort of looking at which language they're using to communicate with people outside of their home. So, for instance, in Nigeria, there's many different languages spoken there, but their common lingua franca is English. This goes for many other countries. I also looked at countries' traditions, like demographics. We also looked at religion for culture too. But for culture, we also included if people are not religious, because you can certainly be Christian but not be practicing Christian in the demographic category. But as far as how somebody practices the religion, that sort of more goes into the culture. And not only did we look at their denomination, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, also looking at different customs. For instance, some countries have different holidays than other countries, both religious and secular holidays. Also, circumcision practices. This is a very interesting aspect that can cross different religious and racial lines. For instance, in Korea, most people are circumcised, whereas in Japan, most people are not. But circumcision originally came from the Middle East. Another aspect of culture that I looked at was recreation. Sports is a huge part of people's culture. So I looked at what the favorite sport of each country was, which sports they really like to take part in, which Olympic sports they got medals in, and how successful they were at sporting events. Then I think a huge part of culture, everyone would agree, is the food and drinks they're eating. I looked at how much meat each country eats and also what kinds of meat they eat, what kind of dairy products they eat. Do they eat a lot of eggs, cheese, or not dairy products at all? Do they eat a lot of fruits or vegetables? And also, what kind of starches do they eat? For instance, some countries eat a lot more rice versus other countries eat a lot more wheat. A third aspect that I looked at was the politics of a country and the government. For instance, how the government is set up. Is it a monarchy? Is it a democracy? Is it a dictatorship? And what methods are used to select the leaders of the country, whether it was by popular vote, whether it's by appointments or heredity. Then I also looked at the various policies that the country has. For instance, marriage laws, whether you can have a gay marriage, whether you can practice polygamy, also obscenity laws, whether prostitution is legal or not, whether you can have an abortion or not. And there's a gradient of all of these. Gun control, and also the legality of drugs. Furthermore, governments require people to do certain things. Some countries require people to do military service. Others require them to do jury duty, a mandate that you go to school for a much longer period of years than others. Some countries have mandatory voting. You must vote in those countries. And others, it's completely optional. And even in others, there's no voting. I'm also looking at the tax obligation of different countries, whether there's a lot of taxes on people or not. But to go to the other end of the spectrum, there's also a lot of things that governments do for their people. For instance, some governments entitle people to health care, to education, to welfare, and to pensions. And that's another aspect that I looked at. Finally, the enforcement of these policies varies from one country to another. For instance, some countries have very authoritarian governments that have a lot of censorship, while others are more open. Some countries have a higher rule of law, and also looking at the legal system. Some countries use what's called civil law. Other countries use common law. And also looking at the punishment. Some countries don't allow there to be a death penalty, and some countries don't even allow there to be people in prison for life either, versus other countries have both. Another aspect that I looked at was cooperation between countries. For instance, some countries like in Europe have a common currency or are a part of a trade bloc. Another aspect I looked at was defense alliances, how much military alliances there are between different countries. For instance, NATO is a famous military alliance where European and United States and other countries come together to form a shared military. Looked at border control and which countries have a very lax border control policy versus which have a very strict border control. And also looking at immigration policy. How easy is it to immigrate to the country? Some countries it's very easy, and other countries it may take you more than 10 years and be very difficult to attain citizenship. The fourth way that I looked at how countries could be different from each other would be their technology and their infrastructure. I first looked at their water and their plumbing, their water usage, their water quality, the percentage of people that have a good sanitation in their homes. Another aspect that I looked at was the electricity of a country. How is the electricity created? How much electricity is used? What voltage was there? Also, you always know when you're traveling to different countries, you need an adapter usually for their plugs. So that was another factor. A third aspect that I looked at was the communication, how much radio, telephone, television communication there is, and the internet and the different platforms. For instance, some countries use certain websites more than others. Another aspect of technology that I looked at was transportation. How many cars are there in a country per person? Also looked at trains, how many passenger trains there are in a country. Also looked at the different types of cars and trains there are in different countries. For instance, some countries drive on the left side of the road versus other countries drive on the right side of the road. And furthermore, for trains, there's a big difference in the infrastructure of countries for trains. The rail gauge is different, meaning the distance between the two different railroad tracks is different in different countries, and that can have an effect on what kind of train vehicle is being used there. Then I also looked at airplanes and how much airport infrastructure each country has. Furthermore, I looked at the medical capability of a country, how sophisticated their hospital infrastructure is, and also the military capability of a country and how sophisticated their military is. You know, some countries spend a lot more money on the military and others don't even have an active military. And then the final aspect that I looked at was geography, where the country is on the map, what continent it's on, what tectonic plate the country is on, what hydrologic region it's in. Does its water flow to the Atlantic or the Pacific? Then I also looked at terrain. Is the country generally flat or very mountainous? Is it high elevation or low elevation? I also looked at water, how much coastline a country has, how far are most of the land from the water, also the amount of lakes that a country has. Furthermore, I looked at climate. Temperature and precipitation are the two main factors, but also the combination of the two, which creates different climates like the desert, rainforests, polar regions, etc., etc. I also looked at how people inhabit the country. For instance, is the country densely populated? And furthermore, are people bunched up in the cities or are they spread out in rural areas? And I also looked at animals. Is there a high variety of animals in a country or a low variety? Some countries have more similar animals to each other than others. There's different sort of animal regions in the world. Furthermore, I looked at the vegetation of a country. What kind of plants are in the country? Is there a lot of wilderness? Is there a lot of agriculture? And what kind of agriculture is being grown in that country? What kind of wild plants natively grow in that country? And finally, I looked at the human impact of the geography. For instance, how many skyscrapers there are in the urban areas, how much pollution there is in the country, whether there's a lot of light pollution, air pollution, those kind of things. So those were my 5 main categories that I looked at. Obviously, there's no way to do this scientifically, but I tried to make sort of look at all the different aspects evenly. And so what I hope to do in future episodes is bring to you country by country, what are the most similar countries to a certain country and what are the least similar countries to a certain country. I think that's actually very interesting too, to know sort of what the opposite country is to your country. Yeah, so I'd appreciate you to follow and subscribe to this to see future videos.
And this is what we'll study: the language, culture, gender, politics, religion, population, and so much more of that tiny little speck in this vast universe. Thank you for joining me on this quest. Please do your readings, send me an email. I hope you enjoy the discussion for the week, and I look forward to interacting with you. Thanks. Have a great week.